Hello, everyone. My name is Harvey Brownstone, and today we're going to explore an issue that for much too long has been ignored, underestimated, and stigmatized: mental health. My guest is a highly respected and internationally renowned psychologist, Dr. Irwin Butkowsky. Irwin, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for inviting me.
Irwin, in the last year, there's been so much emphasis on the pandemic, the illnesses, the deaths, the enormous challenges to businesses, the high unemployment. But there's another casualty of the pandemic that gets much less attention: the impact on mental health. What are you seeing in your practice?
Well, I want to begin by commenting that, I don't think we're going to actually see all of the consequences of this pandemic on mental health for many, many years to come. I expect that this is going to be a subject of much research, millions of dollars in research grants, and many doctoral dissertations, because some of these effects are going to be long-term. What I think we do know, what science tells us, what experience tells us, what common sense tells us, is that prolonged exposure to stress, anxiety, fear, and social isolation has profound impact not only on mental health, but on physical health. What I'm seeing in my practice are people who are very concerned about their kids. I'm seeing increases in sibling conflict. I'm seeing increases in marital conflict and anticipated separation. And I say anticipated because it's hard to separate in the midst of a pandemic. I'm seeing addictions, but perhaps not all the ones that you might expect. I've seen a significant increase in adolescents' addiction to video games, in part because parents are reluctant to set limits because there's nothing else for their kids to do, in part because that's become the sole source of social interaction for a lot of these kids.
Right.
And they are developing addictions which are very resistant to any kind of limitation. And that's causing family conflict. I'm certainly seeing significant impact in the elderly. Many elderly, even those who live independently, have been isolated from their families. Increases in depression. I think that as a result of the lack of programming available in senior citizens' residences, in long-term care homes, there's significant cognitive deterioration because of a lack of stimulation. A lot of these elderly are basically sitting in their rooms and watching TV all day. And it's very sad.
It's so sad. I want to talk to you about the working from home situation. Some people are saying that although there are some obvious conveniences to working from home, there are also some serious stresses that can affect mental health. What's your take on that?
Well, certainly one of the things that I'm seeing, and in fact experienced, because I've been at home for months at a time during lockdowns, is that it's harder to compartmentalize work, play, and family life. And it's difficult to establish effective boundaries and avoid distractions and intrusions. You're, I think, also missing the energy of your colleagues in the workplace, and so people are more tired and less focused and much more distractible. I know everybody's talking about, sort of the new world, and businesses are finding out how much more economical it is to have people work from home, and they're not going to go back to the workplace. I don't actually believe that at all. I think more people are going to go back to work than we think, for all kinds of reasons. One, for the energy that it brings. Two, for the stimulation that it brings. Three, it's important to separate work from play and from family, and to have those boundaries. That helps us psychologically, emotionally. It helps us in our relationships. Going to work is not only going to work, it's going to work to have fun, to socialize with colleagues, employers, and so forth. And I also think employers are going to want to keep a closer eye on their employees as well. It's a little harder to do remotely.
For sure. A lot of marriages are suffering right now. The stress of being in lockdown combined with financial pressures, worries about children not getting a proper education or having a healthy social life. What do you say to couples who are really struggling with trying to get along with each other through this nightmare?
Well, look, the idea that you would spend 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, over a period of more than a year with even your most beloved partner is a little bit overwhelming. In part, relationships work because we go to work and we have a bit of space. We go see our friends. We engage in physical fitness activities. We socialize without our partners. That feeds and nurtures the relationship. And when you're at such close quarters, effectively captive in a lockdown, it's not only going to bring out the best, it's going to bring out the worst. So, what I say to people is get some perspective on this. We're living in extraordinary times. It's predictable that your marital relationship is going to suffer. You need to take a step back. You need to be patient and wait for some kind of normalcy to resume before you make major life-altering decisions about your relationship.
Really good advice.
We should never make major decisions under duress.
Some people say that the emotional effects of the pandemic have been the hardest on young people. And by that, I mean the kids whose schooling has been so dramatically interrupted, but also young adults. What are you seeing and hearing about in your practice with teenagers, young adults?
Yeah, interestingly, and I'll say more about it, just this morning, I read an article which didn't in any way surprise me, a recent study that demonstrates that emergency room visits to some of the major pediatric hospitals have substantially reduced, but visits to address suicidal attempts and suicidal ideation have dramatically increased. So we're actually beginning to see what some of the impact of all this social isolation and academic pressures resulting from online learning are and may continue to be for some time. I see kids who are starved to have their ordinary needs met. Certainly in adolescence, the need for affiliation is paramount. And this is not being met because they're quarantined and isolated unless they're out there taking unnecessary risks. So I also see in young children a tremendous increase in fearfulness. And the manifestation of that, not surprisingly, is obsessive compulsive behavior.
Really?
Because in fact, we're preaching obsessive compulsive behavior. Wash your hands, wear your mask, don't get so close. In children who are predisposed to anxiety, this is tremendously exacerbating the level of anxiety and fear that they experience. And yet it's necessary to keep them safe. And this is a personal, topic for me. I don't know that we know what the effect is of depriving young children from relationships with their grandparents and extended family. I have 5 grandchildren. I'm restricted to playing ball hockey on the driveway in masks, sometimes in bitter cold. It's not a great way to have a relationship.
No.
I have a 16-month-old granddaughter who, when we FaceTime, occasionally smiles, occasionally blows kisses, but she doesn't really know who I am. And we don't know what the effect of that is going to be. Children are being deprived of normal familial relationships in the service of staying alive.
We're also seeing an alarming increase in substance abuse during the pandemic. Almost every region in North America is reporting increased overdoses, increased criminal charges for substance abuse. There must be a connection between the substance abuse increase and the pandemic. There must be.
Well, I think so. I don't have any science to support this, but I suspect that there are two reasons why there would be an increase. Number one, people are bored. There's not a whole lot else to do except read a book, watch TV, surf the net, and engaging in self-medication to assuage one's loneliness is not in any way uncommon. The second reason, I think, is, well, you can have your alcohol delivered by the LCBO. You can have your local marijuana retail outlet delivered to your door, and apparently you can have your dealer deliver. So, you know, if you combine those two things, to me, there's no surprise that there's an increase. All you have to do is walk down the street on garbage day and see the empties.
That's true.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about the explosive interview that Oprah did with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. She alleged that she was feeling extremely depressed and even suicidal, and that when she asked the powers that be for therapeutic help, they refused. Now, those comments have triggered a lot of discussions about society's attitudes towards mental health. Do you think that this is a common thing, that there are a lot of people out there who ask for mental health support and are being refused or dismissed?
I think to answer that question, you have to look at context first. There's little question that in, you know, decades or centuries past, there was a tremendous stigma associated with mental health issues and seeking treatment for mental health. You know, when I started as a psychologist 40 years ago, if you went to see a psychiatrist, you would enter through one door into a small waiting area. You'd then be ushered into the psychiatrist's office, but you'd leave by another door so that nobody would see.
Wow.
And that was common practice. But the world has changed a great deal. And I think attitudes toward mental health in many societies, certainly here in North America, have changed tremendously. There's insurance coverage. There are facilities and centers for this. The notion that there is a stigma or should be a stigma attached to mental health is, to my mind, archaic. And maybe we need to take a look, with all due respect, at the institution that denied the assistance and think about whether or not it has simply failed to come into the 21st century.
But I still hear people say, when they hear celebrities talking about their mental health problems and they speak positively about therapy and counseling, I still hear people say, well, therapy is only for the very rich. Obviously, unless you're a famous movie star with a lot of money, you can't get any help.
Well, that's not entirely true. Certainly, you know, when it comes to publicly funded services, the waiting lists are much longer. But it is available if you seek it. It's available through your family doctor. It's available through your local hospitals. There are mental health facilities all over the continent. It is available. Now, are people reluctant? I think there's some of that left. You know, I don't hear much about people being denied mental health treatment, because if they're calling me, they're looking for help.
Right.
You know, I suppose that may happen at a family level, where a young person might go to a parent and say, I think I need some help. And an old-fashioned parent might say, you know, suck it up. You need to handle things on your own. I suspect there are parents like that out there, or partners like that out there. But I don't think the same stigma applies as it did years ago.
Well, I still get the feeling among some circles that mental health issues are still considered taboo or shameful. Like, for example, let's talk about the workplace for a moment. Many people fear that if it ever became known that they reached out for help, that it might affect their chances for promotion. I've heard that time and time again. What do you say to people who feel that way?
Well, I think they're probably reality-based. I think that's probably good judgment, particularly if there is some indication that the individuals who will be responsible for determining promotion have these kinds of outdated ideas. in my world, seeking help for psychological difficulty represents a strength, not a limitation. But that isn't the view of everyone in society. I accept that. But it has changed over time. I suppose in certain cultures, the same stigma remains. Certain societies, the same stigma remains, but we need to continue to work to remove that stigma. Because it's no different than going to your family doctor for help, with an ingrown toenail. It encompasses so many things. It's not, I think one of the common associations is if you go seek help from a mental health professional, you're somehow crazy. But people seek help from mental health professionals for all kinds of reasons. They may have difficulty sleeping. They may have difficulty coping with stress. They may have self-esteem issues. Relationship issues, identity issues. The number of individuals who would seek help for the more serious mental health problems is less, because it's less in the population at large. And it's in part because seeking therapy has become normalized, that people are not so averse to going to get help with a sleep problem, for example, or a bad habit.
I want to return for a moment to the issue of suicide. Everybody has commented that suicide statistics are astonishingly high, especially for young people under 30. If someone in our audience is concerned that a loved one might be suicidal, what should they do?
Well, I'm going to give the same advice that I've been giving for most of my career. And I've myself acted on this advice in relation to clients that I've had or people that I know. If you suspect that a family member or a friend may be suicidal, or even if a family member or a friend is verbalizing suicidal ideas, even to the extent that you may not take them seriously and see it as manipulative, I would encourage you to do whatever you can to get them in your car, drive them to the emergency department of your local hospital, and have them assessed. I believe you should err on the side of caution, because to not do so, you're risking a life. And I'd rather overreact than underreact in this kind of circumstance. And even if the verbalized intention is purely manipulative, then taking that kind of action may discourage them from that type of manipulation the next time and get them to ask for help in a more reasonable and positive way. I've not only done that, I've taken steps to have clients of mine certified even when I wasn't sure.
Yeah, I really like that cautious approach.
A false
that
negative has
proactive.
far more serious consequences than a false positive.
What about a parent that believes their teenager or maybe a child in their 20s is having emotional problems? Maybe not suicide, but they can tell that their child is really suffering emotionally. What's the best way to convince your child to get help if they don't want to?
That's a difficult task. Some of the techniques that I've recommended to parents are to express concern. We're worried about you. We want to go see a mental health professional as a family. Get them in the door. Or persuade them to go one time. If they don't like it, then they don't have to continue, and then leave it to the mental health professional to, effectively establish sufficient rapport and trust so as to engage them. But there are limits to that. If they refuse, there's nothing you can do about that.
That's a real worry.
It's an issue of consent. And, one of the enigmas of that for me is that I have never met an adolescent who needed therapy that would agree to it and consent to it up front. The ones that ask for it probably don't need it in the first place. I'm being only somewhat facetious, right? So you somehow have to persuade them to come and then leave it to the mental health professional to, in effect, engage them. I think in part, it's not just a matter of stigma for these kids, it's fear. of what this is about and what may come out. It's fear of, personal things being disclosed to parents and other family members and peers. I think all of those things inhibit young people from seeking help.
Oh, absolutely. Are there warning signs that people should look for in themselves and in their loved ones of a potential mental health crisis? I mean, everybody's feeling depressed and stressed these days, but how do you know when you or your loved one needs help?
Well, I think that's about observing significant changes in fundamental patterns of daily life.
Right.
Things like chronic sleep problems that never existed before, uncontrollable tearfulness, changes in appetite, weight loss, weight gain, difficulty attending and concentrating, difficulty coping with stress. You're looking for marked changes that are prolonged over time. I mean, everybody has bad days and bad weeks and even bad months, but if it continues and persists, it's important to get help because those patterns can become habitual, deeply ingrained, and much more resistant to change.
Right. When I talk to people who believe that they need help, but they're afraid to get it, I get the impression that part of their fear is that they don't know what kind of help is available. For example, when do you need a psychologist and when do you need a psychiatrist?
Well, that's an interesting question. A psychiatrist you will absolutely need if you are looking to be medicated, because psychologists do not have prescription privileges, psychiatrists do. I think if you're looking for a biological approach, then a psychiatrist is most appropriate. If you're looking for some kind of psychotherapy, then a psychologist is more appropriate. But the reality is that some psychiatrists do provide psychotherapy. I think the best way forward is to ask your family doctor, with whom you already have a relationship, who has the ability to refer you, and allow them to make the determination as to who might be most appropriate. And in part, that's also a question of availability. Availability because psychiatrists are covered under OHIP, psychologists are not. And if you don't have insurance coverage, you may not be able to afford a psychologist. So it's access to services that will partly determine that.
So always start with your family doctor.
I think that's the best place to start. Friends and other family members may also be of help. Many of my referrals come from word of mouth, from previous clients.
You know, when I've talked to some people, both at work and just in my social life, and they've mentioned that they may feel that they would benefit from therapy, they always end up saying, well, I don't want to spend a whole lot of years and a lot of money digging into my past and my childhood. I'm afraid I'm just going to make everything worse. Can you tell us in a general way what actually happens in therapy?
Well, I first want to respond to the context of your question. Therapy isn't always long-term and prolonged. Many of the people I see 2 to 6 times, and that's it. I think the common association with therapy comes from film and literature and refers to sort of classic psychoanalytic style psychotherapy, wherein the good Dr. Freud sat on a chair out of view of his client who lay on a couch, and he saw them 4 times a week for 7 years, because back then, if you were trying to sustain a practice in psychiatry, you didn't have a lot of clients and you had to have them come often and for a long time.
That is the stereotype. People say, oh, if I go into therapy, I'll be there forever. It's very
That's not necessarily.
It's very good to hear you say that it's often not a long-term process.
No, it's sometimes quite targeted. If you're coming to therapy because you have a phobia that you want treatment for, like a fear of elevators, you might be done in 2 or 3 sessions. It isn't always long-term. In part, that's going to depend on the philosophy and practice of the therapists themselves. I, for one, believe that my job as a therapist is to render myself obsolete as quickly as possible. So what happens in therapy very much depends on the theoretical orientation and experience and skill set of the therapist. It depends primarily on what the goal of treatment is. Some therapies are aimed at simply providing emotional support to people in difficult times. Some therapies are targeted towards certain behaviors or patterns of behavior, either to modify or eliminate them. Those kinds of therapies can be completed in a single session in some instances. I recall, and this is just a kind of entertaining anecdote, a young woman who came to me to deal with her nail biting behavior because she was ashamed of her hands and the way that they looked. And so I asked her, after some rapport building, which was her favorite hand to bite her nails. And she said, it was the left. And so I said, well, that's fine. Between now and our next session, I only want you to bite the nails on your left hand. Can you make that commitment and never bite them on your right? She called me a week later and canceled the appointment because she realized if she could discriminate between the hands, she could just stop altogether.
That was brilliant.
Well, it was just about making the unconscious conscious for her, right? So some therapies are what we call insight oriented. They're about self-growth development. They're about learning about where you come from and what the influences were in your early family life and why you've come to be the way you are, usually in the service of some chronic life problem like relationship difficulties or self-esteem issues. And you want to take some time to explore the origins of that. There are some who believe that insight is sufficient for behavior change. There are others who do not. And insight or an understanding into one's past is only the beginning of trying to create change. So what happens in therapy is tremendously variable. What should happen is that you as the client should be the bus driver and the therapist should simply be the navigator.
Well, I think you, as best as one can in this kind of a setting, have given us a feel for what one can expect if they do embark on therapy, depending on what the issue is. Can I ask you a loaded question?
You can always ask, Harvey.
If a couple is having problems in their marriage,
Yes.
Is it a good idea to speak with a marriage counselor? Because I have to tell you honestly, every couple I know who went to marriage counseling ended up breaking up.
Well, even before you said that, I already had the answer to your question.
I'm not surprised.
My experience with doing marital therapy is that couples wait too long. And by the time they come to my office, there is so much damage done that it's almost impossible to repair. So I think that's why your friends and people that you see have that experience. They wait too long. It's too late. It's like a lot of things. If you allow them to fester, they get infected and become much more difficult to treat. Not impossible, but far more difficult.
But I would think even if the couple's marriage is not going to be saved, it's still a good idea to speak with a therapist to at least dissolve the relationship in a civilized way. Absolutely
agree. I sometimes refer to that as separation counseling, although people don't generally call me and ask for that. They usually call and ask for marital counseling. And then within a few sessions, it becomes clear that one partner has already left the marriage, in a sense, psychologically, and what's needed is to support the other partner in coming to accept that and helping them work through a peaceful separation, if you will.
Irwin, as you know, I have always been very concerned about bullying. I was very badly bullied as a kid, and that was bad enough. But now with cyberbullying, people are being victimized on an alarming scale, and it's so pervasive and insidious. Why do you think this is happening? And what makes a person a bully?
Let me answer the first question first. I'm not persuaded that this is happening with any greater frequency than it did in the past.
It sure feels like it.
Simply become labeled. Well, and we now have the internet as an additional vehicle for bullying. Previously, it was the schoolyard and the workplace, primarily, where bullying took place. So we now have a different medium, and you can just sit at home and be a bully.
And you can be anonymous.
Correct, which makes it a lot easier. It disinhibits you from doing it. Now, why do people become bullies? I think it's many reasons. Sometimes these are individuals who have themselves been bullied or victimized in some way. Often they are individuals who struggle with feelings of inadequacy and low self-worth. They're compensating. Bullying has now been identified. When you were a kid, if it happened in the schoolyard, you didn't go tell your teacher. You had to suck it up because the negative fallout from peers would be too great.
You just said a mouthful.
You would be called a sissy, right? That's a word we don't hear very often anymore. Now, bullying is condemned in schools. It results in suspensions, expulsions. It's become acceptable to report it. But that wasn't true until recently. We now have lots of scientific research into bullying, lots of programs for dealing with bullying. It's become a much more identified behavior, but the increase is in no small way due to the internet and the ability to do it anonymously.
Is there therapy for bullies?
Well, I think that the same kind of therapy that exists for all kinds of problems of aggression exists for bullies. So I think the answer to that is an absolute yes.
Well, Irwin, I think you've done everyone a great service by shining a light on the extremely important subject of mental health. I hope everybody watching and listening will be mindful of the need to be not only physically healthy, but also emotionally healthy. And if you could benefit from reaching out to a mental health professional, please do it. And don't let anybody talk you out of it or make you feel ashamed. Reaching out for help, as Irwin has said, is a sign of strength, not weakness. Irwin, thank you very much for your time and your valuable insights.
It's been my absolute pleasure, Harvey.
My name is Harvey Brownstone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to our producer, Steve Silver. See you next time.